This week in the Regency, we're investigating a very strange occurrence that happened in Rochdale, near Manchester. Last week, a part of the Rochdale Canal in the neighbourhood of Manchester was let off. That means they closed the locks off so that the water drained away for the purpose of cleaning it of the mud, etc. In performing which, the workmen have made curious discoveries of various forts. I think maybe it's forms, I think it's a typo, of various forms of property, thrown in, no doubt, by nocturnal and wicked depredators. Depredators? Not sure. Such as wearing apparel, articles of household furniture, etc. But what is most strange, a bundle containing the halves of £2 original Bank of England notes to the amount of some thousands. Now, some thousands is like some millions now. You could live reasonably well on £100 a year. So thousands of pounds, maybe it's more like billions. You know, it's huge, huge amount of money just thrown away. And this got me very interested because of two things. First of all, it's just very odd and interesting. And secondly, in a book that I have coming out later in this year called Long Meg and the Wicked Baron, which is set in a place called Little Foxbury, two of my characters are discussing how they want to drain the canal and clean it up. And immediately I thought, oh, this is the plot for the next book in that series. So keep an eye out for it. So fascinating, just in every possible way to me. And so I followed it up. We'll come to that in a minute. But first of all, just to orient you, we'll talk about the Rochdale Canal. Where is the Rochdale Canal? It passes through Rochdale, which is where it gets its name. Typically, canals were named after the first section, like the town in the first section that was opened. And in this case, that was Rochdale. And it goes from further north down to Manchester, and its main purpose was bringing coal into Manchester and goods out of Manchester to other places, because Manchester was at this stage, and indeed still is, an important manufacturing area. This is what it looks like now. And you can see on this image that you've got the number 12. Each of the bridges and locks on a canal are numbered. It helps with navigation by the canal boat people. And there are 92 locks on the Rochdale Canal, although only 91 operate now. It was built in the 1790s. To build a canal, you have to have an act of parliament because you have to force people to sell you their land. And the act of parliament allows you to force people to sell you their land in order to make a canal. And it took 3 tries before Parliament was convinced it was a good idea. But in 1794, they passed that act of parliament, and the first section of the canal going through Rochdale was opened in 1798. And subsequent sections, the bulk of it was opened by 1800, and then little bits of it further up were 1804 to 1807. So by 1807, the whole length of that canal was open with 92 locks, which is quite a lot. And it was quite a popular canal. It got a lot of use, and by 1812, it had been open, this part, for 14 years and had got silted up and had a lot of junk thrown in it. People used to use canals as tips, dumps. They would just throw their rubbish into the canal. And so we find, wearing apparel and articles of household furniture. It was also generally believed that thieves would make for the canal if they were being pursued, because if they weren't found with the goods on them, then they couldn't be arrested. So those are the nocturnal and wicked depredators. Okay, so then we get to the banknotes, and I was very interested in this and followed it through. Now, this particular article, the one I read, was published in next week on the 28th of January, 1812, in London. But going back and looking for more information, because it says last week, that's how long it took to get news from Manchester to London. Last week puts us at the 21st, and indeed on the 21st there is there's a note in the Mercury, Manchester Mercury, on the 21st, which says, "We have since learned they were the property of a respectable banking house in this town." So what does that mean? It means that one of the Manchester banks bought a whole lot of banknotes from the Bank of England, £2 notes. There aren't any £2 notes anymore, but there were then. And in fact, £1 and £2 notes started around a bit earlier than this, during the Napoleonic Wars, because it was hard to get gold, and for most of history, coins had been the only kind of legal tender. And then when banks started, they began issuing their own notes, and these were originally in really big denominations, like £100 denominations. And they're intended mostly for travellers. They were like travellers' checks. You got them from one bank, you went to another bank and cashed it in, and they then, by a system of couriers that went all over Europe, they got their money back from the other bank, or they balanced their books at the end of the year and worked out who owed whom. So it was mainly so that you didn't have to carry around like literally £100 of £100 coins. And it was far harder to steal from you when it was a note. And this is where we get to, why would anybody have thrown all these thousands of pounds away after cutting them up? And this is because notes were not just anonymous bits of paper as they are now, or bits of plastic, polymer as they are now. They were individualized. So here is a note from a £1 note from the Bank of England from 1817. Most of it is handwritten. Looks slightly printed, but only the big parts of it are printed. Everything else is handwritten, and it is signed by the chief cashier of the Bank of England at that time. And this is how notes were issued. They were more like a check. So it's not just signed by someone, it's signed to someone, in the same way that you might make it in the past, have made a check out to someone. It's like a bank transfer, effectively. And that note belonged then only to that person, and only that person could roll up to the Bank of England, hand it over, and get a pound coin in return. Lots of banks put out notes. It's not till quite late, I think in the 1850s, that the Bank of England becomes the main bank, although there were still banks in Scotland and Wales that did so. And even now there are still banks overseas, in countries that use pound sterling as their currency, that issue currency. But back then, a note was like personal. It's me, I own it. And it's got my name on it. And if I want to pay for something with it, I sign it over in the same way you could sign a check over, like, please pay cash, so-and-so. you can sign a check over to someone, you can sign a banknote over to someone. And so you can see on the back of this note that there are several signatures, and it went the rounds as legal tender, much as a banknote does now, but with a lot more effort in it because a pound note was worth a lot more then, until it became so tattered that it was handed in to the bank and cashed in. So when we talk about why would anybody have thrown all these away? Well, they weren't usable unless you forged your own name onto them. But given that every £2 note is going to be looked at really, really closely after this, after the theft from that bank, because remember, you can't just cash it in anywhere, you've got to cash it in at that bank. Anybody who walks in with a £2 note made out to themselves, the cashier is going to know they didn't make it out to that person. And so it's quite hard to spend that money. And that's what makes me think that it's a spite thing. So possibly by somebody who got sacked, or possibly by another bank has suborned an employee into doing this, because the Manchester Bank, whatever name it was, and it's never named in any of the newspaper reports, the Manchester Bank would have sunk a lot of its cash into these notes. And you can't redeem that because they get stolen. Maybe they were insured, but insurance didn't work quite the same way then as it does now. They might have had insurance against theft. But more likely they would have had to eat the losses. And the thing about banknotes is that people liked the Bank of England notes, okay? Because your banknote was only as good as the bank that issued it. And if quite often banks went bankrupt, that's where it came from, that term. And they closed their doors, and any notes that they had issued once they closed their doors were worthless. So they were just scrap paper. So people liked Bank of England notes because that was backed by the government. And it was the biggest banking institution that there was probably in the world at that time. And so local banks like the Manchester Bank would go send a courier up to London, and they would buy a whole lot of Bank of England notes, so that they could issue those to their customers, and the customers would have the security of knowing that even if the Manchester Bank went bankrupt, they could still redeem their money from the Bank of England. So it looks to me like either the courier's been intercepted, or when the package arrived, somebody's made off with it. And then the reason I think it's spite is because they've cut it in two. And there was this thing about you can't just tape something together. For a start, they didn't have tape the way we do. It would have to be glued, which means you'd have to put an extra bit of paper onto it, and it would cease to become legal tender. And so I think the reason they've withheld the name of the bank is so that there isn't a rush on the bank to send it bankrupt. Because a lot of people, if they had heard which bank is this, they would have gone, oh my God, they've lost all of their reserves. And indeed, people often kept bank reserves in the form of Bank of England notes. They've lost all the reserves. I'd better get my money out before it goes under. So they have refrained rather nicely, I think, from mentioning the bank to make sure that there is not a rush on the bank, as there was in many banks in the Depression, and they just all closed their doors, and people lost everything. Probably what's going to happen here is that the guy from the Manchester Bank, it's always a guy at this point, would go up to the Bank of England and say, look, here are the bits. Can I have new ones, please? I'll pay for their printing and your cashier's time. And the Bank of England will probably go, yep, sure. And so no one is worse off at the end of this process, probably. But why did they do it? You know, it's so interesting why they did it. Not even keeping one as a souvenir. I don't know, maybe they did keep one as a souvenir. I think in my story they will. But that opened the door for me thinking about currency and the way the British currency worked at this time. And I think there'll be another look at that further down the track. But at the moment, we have workmen. Can you imagine these workmen finding this and thinking at first that they found all this fantastic money and then realizing that it was completely useless to them? So that's what happened this week in the Regency. If you want to know what happens next week in the Regency, please subscribe.